Yeah, we need to swap over.
Right, shall we just change over?
Swap, yeah. Shall I do each?
Yeah. Can you see Judy full face, Jonathan?
I can't see me.
Jonathan? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I had myself switched off. Yes, no problem.
Good. You're on that. You can turn that.
No, I'm fine. No, no. No. Thank you.
Bottom right hand corner, there is a clock. Bottom right hand corner of the screen.
Oh, yeah, 10:30.
Right. In which case we'll go. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another sparkling edition of How Nasty Our Ancestors Had to, how they coped and how nasty times were. For those of you that perhaps haven't been with Judy through several of these cycles, you won't perhaps realise just how much she revels in the gruesome and the nasty and the horrible aspects of history. But be prepared for a good session. And you'll notice that we've now moved on from primroses to daffodils. Judy, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Martin. Welcome back, Jonathan. Glad you're back with us.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, hello, everybody. The Black Death, I've called it the bubonic plague because that's its correct title. Just to share with you, pupils that I taught at Arthur Terry used to call this, well, a lot of them, even though they could spell perfectly well, most of the time, spelt plague plorge. So you were in the wrong place. Take all these books in and have to correct their spelling. I don't know why, but they just got plague wrong, plorge. So that's what we called it. There's some joke at home. The Black Plorge. The bubonic plague is its correct title. So I've started off by explaining how it spread. We know that it started in Central Asia. Nobody's exactly sure where it started, possibly India, possibly China, possibly what is now Mongolia, excuse me. We know it went to the Crimea. It took 8 years to reach Sicily. It was kind of slow spreading to begin with, and then it spread very rapidly because of trade from the Middle East into Europe, particularly via Constantinople and the big trading centres like Venice and Genoa. And once it reached Europe, it spread like wildfire. And it reached Bordeaux in 1342. At which point, people in this country began to get quite interested in it. They had heard from travelling traders, thank you, Martin, and peddlers and people who travelled around exchanging goods, that something awful was happening hundreds and thousands of miles away, but we really didn't pay much attention because we're an island. So we thought we were immune, we thought we were all right. But when it reached Bordeaux, the government in this country and the king, Edward III, began to sit up and take notice. And so quarantine measures were taken. no trading of goods, no contact with foreign traders, etc. But by the time this was introduced, the plague had already travelled. It was sort of ahead of the game. And the belief is that the plague entered this country via a little place called Melcombe Regis in Dorset, near Weymouth, and that it was a box of fabrics that when somebody opened it, the plague germs all leapt out, and people in that place started to die. They had ignored the embargo. So the legend is that it was a God's judgment for disobedience. They had disobeyed the rules. They had traded with a country where the plague was rife by this time. It had reached what we now call the Channel ports, and people had no right to be trading with France because people were dying like flies. And by this time, 1348, the weather had been rather strange. It had been incredibly hot. There'd been one heat wave after another, and then it was wet. And so the weather was blamed for the rapid spread of the pestilence. A very interesting feature of the plague was that certain countries thought they would be immune. They thought they wouldn't be. They thought of it as God's curse, and therefore the Scots in particular said, well, it might devastate England, serves them right. They are an ungodly lot in England. They're all eating rich, well, not all, but people are eating rich food. They're wearing ridiculously expensive clothes. It's God's curse on a materialistic society. We, on the other hand, in Scotland, are God-fearing, good people, and we're not spending all our money on fripperies and nonsense. We are God-fearing, so we won't get the plague. Well, of course, they did, because God had sent the plague, but nobody knew what had caused it. They thought that it was a punishment for vanity, lust, pride, conceit, and having worldly values. Unfortunately, the plague didn't know all about that, and it did reach Scotland and devastated Scotland, just as it was devastating this country. Nobody quite knows what the actual proportion of deaths, we don't quite know. They used to say 1/3 of the whole population died. And that might be what you were told at school. It was certainly what I was told at school. 1/3 of the population died in Europe and in this country. That has now been changed by investigations and finding a lot of skeletons in different places. And it's been raised. And now the teaching is that half the population died, which is absolutely terrifying. Half, 50% of the population of Europe, that included us, of course, died as a result of the bubonic plague. Terrifying. What caused the bubonic plague? What did our ancestors think had caused the plague? Planetary influences. Our ancestors were very, very keen on what's called cosmology. If your planets are in the wrong place, then you could be struck down as an individual. If the planets were very much bad planets were in conjunction, if you had 3 planets doing something naughty, then there would be some sort of national catastrophe. It wouldn't just be isolated. It wouldn't just be confined to certain families. It would be national. If people saw a comet, they got frightened. There's a comet on the Bayer Tapestry. If you saw a comet, then that meant something profound was going to happen, for good or ill, usually ill. So there were many theories put forward by astrologists, cosmologists, saying that, yes, the planets were doing quite peculiar things, so it wasn't surprising that something very dramatic was happening, something bad. There'd also been quite a lot of surprising things happening, like volcanoes erupting and earthquakes taking place. And our ancestors, of course, believed that hell was a real place under this under the earth. The earth was flat, so heaven was above, then there was the earth, and then below the earth, not all that far away, was hell, another level. And of course it was hot and burning in hell. So when there was a volcanic eruption, that was a reminder of hell, that it wasn't all that far away, below us, below the world. And if there was an earthquake, that was a reminder, because Satan had done that. Satan created earthquakes as a reminder that he was powerful and he could move the earth in his anger, and that he was going to come up through some of these fissures in the earth. So people, our ancestors, were very frightened of potholes and underground caves, because that's where they thought that Satan would appear one day if people were really bad, and Satan would take over the world, and it would be the 1,000 years of Satan's rule prophesied in the book of Revelation. So these earthquakes and volcanoes were warnings that something awful was going to happen, that Satan was possibly on the loose, so that when people started dying of plague, it was almost like, well, we can't do anything about it. This is all part of some great cosmic development. Then, in a more practical way, the weather had made the rubbish go bad, and there were bad smells everywhere. So we're getting a little bit warmer, we're getting a little bit closer to reality. Bad smells caused by the very hot weather and then the wet weather, it was all due to smells. And then a nasty one, this always happened, when there was ever a disaster or catastrophe, the Jews got blamed. The Jews had done it. The Jews had poisoned the wells, or the Jews hated Christians and were killing them, infecting them in some way. Officially, we hadn't got any Jews. We'd thrown them out in the reign of Edward I. But there were small Jewish populations keeping their heads down, either pretending to be Christian or just keeping their heads down. They were never totally expelled from this country, but officially they didn't come back. They weren't allowed to come back until 1656 under Cromwell as Lord Protector of the realm. He allowed the Jews to come back, officially allowed them to come back into this country. Another theory was just foreigners. We didn't like foreigners, so the French were certainly blamed. They were often blamed for things that went wrong in this country. The French had done it, regardless of the fact that the French were dying in droves. The French had done it because they were our enemies. And then the one we mentioned already, God's punishment for wicked, sinful behavior, extravagance and worldliness. And then stray cats and dogs, feral cats and dogs. There were lots of these. We'll concentrate on the dogs. There were no rules and regulations then about rubbish collection. So people, as you know, I'm sure you remember this from school, just threw their rubbish outside and waited for it either to get washed away into the nearby watercourse, river or stream, or something would come and eat the rubbish, because a lot of it was leftover food that had gone rotten. In a town, butchers, after they'd divided the carcass up and chopped it up and made it into the food that it could be, was edible and could be sold, and then all the spare parts of the animal that couldn't be eaten, they just threw those outside. And the rubbish collection was done by dogs and pigs, believe it or not. The pigs were earmarked, so people knew who the pigs belonged to, but they were allowed to roam around and sort of eat whatever they could find. So they were the kind of refuse collectors of the time. You do wonder, because obviously they were going to be, they were going to eat, and then there would be droppings. How much tidying up these animals actually did, how useful. And then there were kites, there were ravens, and there were birds that would come and feed on offal. The butchers all lived in one area of the town, as did there was a baker's, a lot of places still got a baker lane or baker's lane, or butcher lane. They all lived in the same area, which helped with shopping. All the butchers lived close together, and the bakers all lived together. They in the same road. Butchers, of course, threw all the spare parts of the animal outside, so it was smelly and rather disgusting. And the name for the butcher's area was the shambles, and so that word became associated with mess. You say something's a shambles, you mean it's out of control. It is really, really untidy. And some of you will have visited the shambles in York, the medieval street, which has been preserved and which is in the summer absolutely jam-packed with tourists. That was the butcher's area in York. So blaming cats and dogs wasn't as wildly ridiculous as it perhaps sounds to us. And they were getting a bit closer to the idea that it was some form of animal life or insect life that was causing the plague. But sadly, King Edward III, via Parliament, decided that cats and dogs were the problem and ordered them all to be killed. And they weren't all feral, some of them were pets. So the pets had to be killed as well. So putting blame on the wrong creatures. Nobody suspected rats and fleas. They thought it might be the dogs and the cats. The pigs they left because they were going to eat them at some point. So the pigs were allowed to continue roaming around, eating whatever they could. I mean, they were useful. They did come and eat all the leftovers from the shambles. So nobody really knew what was causing Black Death, and they came up with various remedies, and we'll show the symptoms shortly. The remedies, well, one of them was actually a good remedy. They did think it was caused by bad smells, and so the king, again by Parliament, ordered a street cleansing program to be undertaken, sweeping away all the rotting vegetables and bits of animals that had been thrown out into a nearby river, or sometimes having a bonfire at the end of each street and burning the refuse, putting it all together and then burning it. Foreigners were under surveillance. They were given a really hard time because they were being blamed for bringing the plague in to this country. It was sort of seen as part of the general case of we were at war with France, so you know they had caused it, but that was quite ridiculous to think that. God's anger. Well, people at first went to church and prayed more than they'd ever prayed, and then they gave gifts to the church, and then a group of people called flagellants developed, and they beat themselves. They made themselves whips or scourges, and they wore sign of penitence, bare feet, bare legs, wore a kind of nightshirt, open down the back, so their back was bare, and they beat themselves, and they walked along chanting, asking for forgiveness, and beating themselves with their scourge until their back just bled. And they were offering contrition and penitence on behalf of society, not just for themselves. And they became known as the flagellants because they were beating themselves. And then, already mentioned, all the cats and dogs had to be destroyed. So none of these came anywhere near dealing with the crisis because nobody was attacking the real cause, which are the rats and fleas. So the symptoms, the first thing that you would notice, and I haven't put this in the notes, the first thing you would notice was that your tongue was swollen and sore. You would notice that when you started trying to eat your next meal, that your tongue felt very uncomfortable and hurt and was swollen and made swallowing difficult. And then you would feel generally ill, as though you'd got flu. You have a temperature. And then you would notice lumps appearing under your arms and in your groins. And that was infected blood affecting the glands. It was sort of like your body was poisoned, your blood was poisoned, and the glands were fighting the infection, but were becoming infected themselves because the infection was much greater than anything the protected glands could deal with. So the glands themselves became infected, and that was the characteristic bubo, a horrible swelling. People described it as like half an apple developing, so that you under your arms it would hurt very, very much. It would be like a huge carbuncle or boil with poison in it, with pus inside it, throbbing and hurting. Meanwhile, your temperature would be going up. Some people had, as their blood was infected, they got a collection of blood blisters in a pattern, which looked like as if a flower had dropped its petals in a little circle of purplish, bluish petals, like blood blisters, which is what they were. As the blood was infected, it kind of came onto the surface of the skin. And look, some people thought it looked quite pretty, a collection of what looked like petals, and they were called plague flowers. Another very worrying development was if people survived the first stage, and then the second stage, when the buboes started to develop, some people survived long enough for the poison, the infection to reach their brain, and they became delirious. And instead of lying in bed, which was the obvious thing to do if you were ill, and fetching a priest because you were on the verge of dying, so you needed a priest to hear your last confession and say the correct rites over you as you died. Instead of doing that, which was standard behavior, people whose infection had reached their brains refused to go to bed, went out into the street, joined other people who were in the same state, and danced wildly, just danced. And this filled our ancestors with absolute horror, because it was so weird and awful that these people should be lying in bed, making their last confession. And far from that, some of them were shouting. They were behaving so strangely and wildly. Obviously, the devil had got into them. They were possessed by Satan. And they refused all attempts to get hold of them and pull them back into the house and make them go to bed. They wouldn't. They somehow had manic strength, although they're on the verge of dying, and some of them dropped dead as they were dancing, which was terrifying for our ancestors to see this behavior. They couldn't understand what on earth was happening. They'd never seen anything like it before. People dancing wildly and shouting and behaving so strangely and so inappropriately. And it became known as the dance of death. I say people dropped dead while they were dancing, which is even more terrifying. And then there was another different type of called, we know now, pneumonic plague, which affected the lungs. And that was really quick. That could be within a few hours of feeling ill, coughing and spluttering, affecting your breathing, dying. So you could be talking to somebody in the morning and they were dead in the afternoon, which is even more terrifying for our ancestors. It would be terrifying for us. So that was a different form of the same thing, but it took a different form. It affected the lungs, and that was called the pneumonic type of plague. So altogether, very frightening indeed. Whichever way you look at it, people dying in great numbers, and nobody really knowing what to do about it. The remedies were very interesting. And Martin's found a whole list of remedies, which I'm not doing. People would try sort of anything really, because they didn't know what had caused it, so they didn't know. They didn't really know how to sort of deal with it. But they were willing to try anything. I'll just mention a few of them: rubbing onions, vinegar, garlic, herbs, or a chopped up snake. I don't know where you got your snake from, but anyway, you go and find a snake and chop him up and put him on the boils to see if that would work. Pigeons or chickens. Now, this continued for a long time. The idea of blood having curative properties. This continued for many, many years. Leeches. That wasn't an awful. That wasn't a crazy idea. Leeches to suck the poison out of the buboes. Human excrement. That again, that sounds absolutely disgusting, but that was used quite a lot. And urine. And infuse your house with herbs or incense. Now that wasn't a bad idea to purify it. Punish the people that you thought had caused the problem. Yes, that was certainly seemed like a good idea. There are a lot of they're not called pogroms in this country, but certainly attacks on Jews. They not all that long ago they found a well in Norwich when they were doing some massive reorganisation, the centre of Norwich, and they found a medieval well and full of skeletons. And when they did DNA on the skeletons, they were all Jewish. And so they believed it, and the period of time was right, that they believed that they were killed as a result of the Black Death and put down a well to hide the fact that had happened. But that would be the population themselves just rising up against their Jewish neighbours. And there weren't supposed to be any Jews, but they lived a hidden sort of life. But people would know that they were Jewish and turned against them and killed them and thought that would work. It would please God too, because they were Christ killers. That would please God. One remedy, well, it wasn't a remedy. One thing that people tried, which gave its name, it gave its name to a nursery rhyme. Smelling something nice to counteract the bad smells all around. That if you inhaled something lovely, like the scent of flowers, you wouldn't get the plague. Or certainly you wouldn't get the dancing in the street sort of plague. You wouldn't reach your brain. But it would also prevent you getting the illness at all. So people went into gardens and into the countryside, and they picked sweet-smelling flowers mixed with herbs, and they made what was called a nosegay. And there were flower sellers selling these, making a lot of money because people believed that would help. And inhaling, sort of walking about, inhaling the scent of the flowers. Or if you were well-to-do, you could have a pomander. Pom from the French for an apple. Although they didn't usually use apples, if they could get hold of the oranges, obviously we don't grow oranges, so they'd have to be imported. The original idea of a pomander, it was an apple, but then they found oranges were even better. They've got an even stronger scent than apples. So you peel your orange carefully, take the middle out, eat that, fill the middle with spices if you can get hold of them. Only rich people could afford spices. Spices were a little drum of spices. Now, we get a little drum of pepper, cheaply. £100 on the spice market in London for that same amount of ginger or pepper. £100, which was thousands and thousands of pounds in modern money. Rich people could afford spices. Our ancestors, not being rich, would use herbs. Put those inside the orange, where the flesh had been. put the peel back, because the peel was good, because that had a strong scent. Wrap it round so that it was all together. And then if you could afford it, again, cloves came from abroad. We didn't grow cloves. Stud it all over with cloves, which have a very, very strong scent. And then you've got the smell of the orange. You've pierced the skin of the orange. You pierced the peel, so that the smell of the herbs or the scent or the spices will come out. And then you've got the cloves as well. So you've got all these lovely strong scents, and you just keep inhaling that when you're out of doors. And that is supposed to drive away all fear and all chance of getting the plague, because they believe that you inhaled it. It came up through your nose. And therefore, if you could block your nose with something that smelled lovely, you wouldn't get the plague. Of course, completely ridiculous, but that's what our ancestors thought. If you couldn't afford a pomander, then flowers. And the nursery rhyme, probably already guessed, ring a roses, a pocket full of posies, our tissue, we all fall down. It's actually a gruesome little nursery rhyme because it refers to the plague. We all fall down means we're all dead. So obviously that didn't work either. And bloodletting was always tried as a last resort, and obviously that didn't do any good. Some people survived, just as some people survive today from all sorts of what appear to be fatal illnesses. Some people don't get things, they have natural immunity, and a few people survived, and of course they could never get plague again. So they were used for collecting bodies and visiting the sick, because our ancestors worked out that once you'd got plague, if you did recover, you would never get it again. And of course some people just didn't get it at all. And Martin's found things that would have worked, but of course our ancestors didn't know about the things that would have worked. They were working they were working from ignorance. They didn't know what this terrible affliction was, and they were very inclined to think that there was nothing you could do because God had done it. It was a punishment for the wicked ways of the world. It was a punishment. So people were dying in droves, and at first they made coffins and buried people separately with all the rites of the Catholic Church. And then the death rate climbed, and the numbers were so enormous that they had to abandon the idea of having separate coffins and just wrap people in a shroud, or wrap them apparently in the sheets in which they died. They wrapped them up in their bedclothes because they did begin to suspect that it was contagious, and that if you kept the bedclothes, you might catch the plague from the bedclothes. So they wrapped people up in the sheet they died in, made it into a shroud, and then, as you know, there were mass burials. Not all that long ago, they found a huge plague pit in London. They found several others, of course. They found one fairly recently when they were digging an underground car park for one of the many tower blocks now appearing in the centre of the city of London. I can't remember whether it's a hotel or an office block, but they were digging an underground car park and they came across this plague pit. They identified it very quickly as being a pit from the Black Death, and they were surprised to find that the skeletons weren't all just tumbled in, all higgledy-piggledy and just thrown in, which is the story, that they got so desperate that they just threw people in. They were arranged properly, head towards the east, so they were aligned correctly, and they had obviously been buried carefully, not just thrown in. And a lot of investigation is still taking place on those skeletons. DNA, I mean, finding amazing amount of information from the teeth, and they can find all sorts of information by just looking at the bone structure. You know, what kind of illnesses people have suffered. what kind of diet, they can work out the diet, what people ate and when there are any shortages because of the bones. So a great deal of very, very intense research going on with those skeletons. Smithfield, it's called the Smithfield skeletons, victims of the Black Death. And yes, they were buried all together, and there would only be one service for them all. And our ancestors found that very disturbing indeed. Another aspect of the plague that they found very disturbing. They wanted an individual funeral and the correct rites and the correct prayer. Well, there were the rites and the prayers, but it was like it being shared by hundreds of people. That's how desperate it had become, that they were having to dig out a section of land and put the bodies all together. There were strict rules and regulations about who should attend these funerals, as they'd begun to work out that it was very contagious, and there were quarantine rules applied. Gradually, the government introduced sensible restrictions, but they were very much working in the dark because they didn't know the actual cause of what they never called it the Black Death. The Black Death was a title that came later because the buboes were so congested with bad blood that they were dark coloured. It was our ancestors called it the Great Pestilence. The Great Pestilence. They never called it the Black Death, and they never called it the plague. They certainly didn't call it the bubonic plague. It was the Great Pestilence.
That actually sounds quite somber, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
It's worse than the Black Death.
Yes, yes, it is. So the consequences of the Black Death, the consequences were profound. Some villages, everybody died. Virtually everybody. There might have been one or two survivors, but they couldn't keep the feudal system going in their village. So they would walk away, they would go and live in another, they would take themselves off to another village where there were some people. There are 17 lost villages in Warwickshire alone. They're called the Lost Villages because they are in the Domesday Book, recorded in the Domesday Book with a healthy population of 200, 300 people living in a village community, following the feudal system. They are mentioned in future documents, paying their taxes or court cases. Those villagers alive and kicking, working well, and they're never mentioned again after 1349. They're gone. They've disappeared. They're lost. They are known as the Lost Villagers. And when I was at university, we went in a dormobile sort of thing to see one of these lost villages with one of our tutors. And I think I mentioned this before. He didn't warn us that we were going to be just walking across a sort of very rough pasture full of cows. And so we girls had all worn our high-heeled stiletto shoes. We didn't realise, foolishly, we didn't realise that we were going to a sort of very rough piece of land. But this tutor kept pointing. He got a stick and he kept pointing and saying, well, you can clearly see where the high street was. No, we couldn't. We were too busy trying to avoid cowpats. You can clearly see where the church was. No, we couldn't. You can clearly see, and he kept on saying, you can clearly see where the windmill was and where this was and where the cottages were. It was such rough pasture, we couldn't. It was full of nettles and docks and very, very tough grass. It was a cow pasture, but there had been a flourishing village there. I mean, that was the whole point. We were looking at the archaeological remains, they weren't archaeological, they were just patterns in the grass which he could see and we couldn't. What you really need to be is in either a helicopter or a small light plane or a hot air balloon, and then looking down you can see where the village was, you can see outlines of the buildings, but you can't really, not when you're not at ground level. So it's a bit of a wasted expedition. but it made an impression on us that there had been a flourishing community there, and it totally disappeared. In many villages, the important literate people had died. The lord of the manor often wasn't literate, but the priest was, usually, and the reeve and the steward and the important people in the village were able to read and write. They often had died. Certainly the priest died because they had gone to people's bedsides when they were dying and they caught the infection. The manorial records were kept in the manor house under lock and key. If there were survivors in the village, but all the important people in the village had died, all the figures of authority, all the bosses had died, the villeins, those are the non-free peasants, the serfs, who were still in the feudal system, they were the bottom of the pecking order. They were only semi-free. They were bondmen, bondwomen. They belonged to the lord of the manor, and they were tied to the village. And above all, they wanted their freedom. Well, this was a good way of getting their freedom. They'd survived. All the authority figures had died. All they needed to do then was break into the manor house, break into the big chest with the 3 locks on it that held the records. They couldn't read or write, but they knew that that's what they were, the records that didn't decide, they recorded whether they were free men or bondmen, and they burned them. They just burned the records. So when the new lord of the manor turned up, the heir to that lord, that manor, we are all free men in this village. And in their heads they were saying, and you can't prove otherwise. We've burned the proof. We're all free. However suspicious the new lord of the manor might be, thinking this is ridiculous, they can't all be free men. He couldn't prove otherwise. The records had been destroyed. So that's worked well for some. I mean, there's always a good side of things that appear to be catastrophes. This was a good result for people. Other peasants joined another village, and often they declared that they were free when they arrived. But many of them headed off for a town. This was their chance. They headed off for a town. And instead of, in the old days, if a non-free peasant escaped from his village, the lord of the manor set the hunting dogs on them, gave them something that they'd owned to sniff, or gave them to the dogs to sniff, and then the dogs, who were trained for hunting, hunted down this peasant who had escaped and was trying to be a free man. If you could stay free for a year and a day, you were officially free. So you had to hide in forests and woods during the day and travel at night, and head towards London if you could, or a nearby, say, Coventry or Warwick, somewhere, a town, or even Lichfield. But you try, if you lived in Sutton, you try and go further than that. Most runaway serfs were caught within 24 hours. And the punishment was a beating and a branding. You were branded on your forehead with an R for runaway, as if you were a cow or an animal. You were branded, an R burned onto your forehead. And then on the balls of both thumbs, an R for runaway. So that's where the expression, a marked man. You're marked for life as dodgy. If you tried again, you were marked again. If you tried a third time, they chopped part of your foot off. So you couldn't run away, but you could still work on the farm. You could still do the Lord's farm work, which is why you weren't supposed to run away in the first place. The Black Death gave a wonderful opportunity to the survivors to take their chance. But particularly if the Lord of the Manor had died. There weren't any hunting dogs to be set on you. And you took a good chance of getting to a nearby market town. And instead of, in the old days, there was a bounty on runaway peasants. So if you managed to catch a runaway peasant and take him back to his village of origin, you got money. And even peasants would take other peasants back. You know, they weren't particularly loyal to each other. But now, instead of claiming the bounty, if they could manage to get to a market town, then they would be greeted with open arms because so many people had died. There was a crisis. There was a desperate shortage of people to do the jobs in the town. So instead of saying suspiciously, where are you from? What's your name? I think you're a runaway. I'm going to take you back and claim the bounty. It was, what can you do? Have you got any skills? Never mind, if you haven't, we'll train you. Because there was a desperate manpower, and woman power shortage. So this was the beginning of the end of the feudal system. It was breaking down. It had been breaking down a bit before, but it was breaking down a lot because of the Black Death. And it was a new life for many people. And it was also the beginning of standardized surnames. It never became official. It just sort of happened gradually in a very English sort of way, sort of evolved. So the first thing people would say when you arrived in the town, where are you from? Now, in the old days, you wouldn't have said. You wouldn't have said which village you were from. Because that meant they were going to take you back. But now it's safe to say, I am John of Sutton. And after a while, that would turn into your surname, John Sutton. I am John of Middleton. I am John of Erdington. That got changed into Yenton, sort of abbreviated. So people were able to escape from their village without any questions being asked, without being returned, without being branded and punished. Great. On the other hand, some villagers hadn't lost all that many. It was quite random. Some villagers hadn't lost all that many peasants, and the lord of the manor hadn't died. And so when the thing died down, as pandemics do eventually, the lord of the manor tried to make everything go back to how it had been, but with a much reduced workforce. He tried to make the surviving peasants do the work, possibly of 2 or 3 other peasants. And of course, they weren't paid. If they were bondmen, they weren't paid. So this went down, as you can imagine, with our ancestors, like a lead balloon, having to work harder with the same restrictions and the same limitations, but expected to work harder. It gradually dawned on lords of the manor, who tried all sorts of things. They tried, using stick instead of carrot, beating them and forcing them and trying to make them do this extra work. Not a good idea. Gradually dawned on the more intelligent lords of the manor that people worked very much better, carrot rather than stick, if they were given some money. So again, breaking down of the feudal system, paying people to work instead of demanding that they work as a right, as a feudal right. They must work, they must do the lord's work on the lord's land for nothing in return for their land and their cottage. So a money economy began to develop. People were paid, they then had to pay for their cottage, and so a sort of a more modern system gradually came into play. Gradually, the old feudal system broke down. Very much triggered, not just triggered by the Black Death, but hastened by the consequences of the Black Death. So there were huge economic consequences. Huge economic consequences. And changes we won't go into detail, but changes in farming systems. In some areas, lords of the manor decided they weren't going to struggle on with a reduced workforce. It wasn't viable, it wasn't sensible, and they changed their farming to something that was very profitable, which was wool. So they turned their land, the land, which was empty, there was nobody to farm it, it was going to rack and ruin, all the land that wasn't doing anything. Let the grass grow, brought in sheep, and had a sheep, what we might say was a kind of mini sheep ranch. Because the wool trade was absolutely booming, despite the Black Death, our main export. So that seemed like a very profitable idea. In other places, and for other families, like the Boleyn family, for example, they benefited because they took over the vacant strips of land belonging to the people who died. And so some families benefited, they stayed in the village, but they gained extra land. Otherwise, it was just lying fallow, it was just lying empty. They took it over and began to flourish and become more and more wealthy. So not everybody left the village. Some people continued to stay in the village of their ancestors. We don't know what our ancestors did. Most people can't trace their family tree that far back, but some of our ancestors obviously survived, or we wouldn't be here now. So it's interesting to sort of speculate on which category our ancestors belonged to. Did they stay in the village? Did they claim to be free? Did they travel? Did they try and go to a town and start a new life? Were they in one of the villages where the Lord of the Manor just insisted on people working harder? I mean, that was the toughest outcome of all. Another consequence was on religion. Very interesting. They used to say that as a result of the Black Death, people became more religious, and you can argue that certainly. There were more pilgrimages to shrines, more money being donated to religious institutions like monasteries and nunneries and cathedrals, and the local parish churches benefited. Many of them were redesigned using the latest techniques and the latest style. Beautiful Gothic advances made, beautiful windows, for example, in what had been a small, dark Norman church with tiny little windows. Beautiful tracery, all sorts of amazing advances in terms of architecture. And people believed that to keep God, to keep on the right side of God so that he wouldn't send this punishment again, he wouldn't punish the whole of Europe and England particularly, they became outwardly very religious indeed. New orders of monks and nuns and friars were established. People increased their alms giving. He gave more money to the church. And it appeared that people were more religious. But, although that is a very interesting theory, and it appears to have credence, plenty of proof of that happening, that people were more religious. Certainly a lot more people going on pilgrimage throughout Europe, visiting shrines and believing in the virtue of holy relics, and a lot more praying to saints, a lot more praying, a lot more, and people attend to church anyway, but they attend to church more often. There was also a problem that many priests had died. There's also recently interesting development. They used the story was that the priests were absolutely fantastic at the time. They were saint-like, and they stayed with dying people and risked getting infection. And the priests were absolutely wonderful and self-sacrificial. And just recently, people have done a lot of research into this and said, no, a lot of them ran away. This was sort of pushed up by the church. They didn't want this reputation that priests had actually legged it and had gone into hiding. And the researchers proved that it was sort of a bit of a myth and a legend that they were all totally loyal. What is not a legend, and what is absolutely accurate, is that there was a crisis after when the Black Death died down. There was a crisis in terms of manning all the parish churches because so many priests had died. It was true. There was a crisis. And so what they did was they did a little bit like they did after the Second World War, where they trained a lot of teachers. They did a 1-year craft course because there was a crisis with teaching. Well, this was a crisis with the clergy. So there was a lot of recruitment. And to hurry things up, they said people could just do a crash course. They could do a quick course. They would learn the Latin off by heart like parrots. They would learn the litanies and the prayers and the services without understanding Latin. In other words, they weren't going to do the university course that had been expected before, that the priest would be literate and could understand Latin. This was, we just need priests really, really quickly. So let's get them trained, but not properly, and get them out to the parish churches that haven't got a priest. You can sort of understand the thinking, but it had a bit of a disastrous effect on the actual preaching of the word, because these priests hadn't really been trained and they just learned things, I say, parrot fashion. They didn't understand the Latin and they couldn't really preach a very academic sort of sermon. They couldn't really explain things because they didn't really understand things themselves. Eventually, this led to the Reformation, but it took a long time to reach that point. Certainly, almsgiving increased with more people giving money in a superstitious sort of way. If I give money to the poor, God will spare me, and I won't I won't get the next round of the bubonic plague, of the great pestilence. The other side of this was cynicism. And if you read Chaucer was the court poet for Edward III. He was the equivalent of the poet laureate. And if you read the prologue to the Canterbury Tales, which of course is the whole idea of the Canterbury Tales, was pilgrims travelling to Canterbury, to the great shrine of St. Thomas a Becket, which was internationally known. I mean, people came from all over Europe to Canterbury, just as our English ancestors travelled to Spain, to Compostela, and to France. It was international. People were travelling all over Europe to visit the shrines, the great shrines. And if they could afford it, they would go to the Holy Land and they would go to the great shrines in Jerusalem. I mean, there were 7 great shrines in Rome. If you could afford to go to Rome, people were doing that. Maybe not our ancestors. It was more difficult because we got to get across the Channel and everything was expensive. But people were travelling a great deal to go on pilgrimage. So Chaucer decided, it was a really brilliant idea, that he would write this poem in a kind of doggerel, and the basis of it would be a group of pilgrims, all from different backgrounds, and they would meet in London in the Tabard Inn. They would then travel to Canterbury, and to while away the time, because it was going to take days and days to get there, they would tell a tale. They would tell a story to the other pilgrims, and the same on the way back. Now, Chaucer never got round to writing the ones on the way back. So he wrote what's called the prologue, which was the introduction, which was a description of each of the pilgrims, a description of what they look like, and also a bit of their backstory. And that's famous in just standing alone, without the tales. The prologue is very important because for us, it's an absolute insight into medieval life at the time of the Black Death, in the reign of Edward III. An absolute insight. It's brilliant. And then the tales, one by one, they all told a story. Then they arrived in Canterbury, and then I say he didn't get round to writing the stories on for the way back because it probably all took him a lot longer than he'd realised. But the insight is fascinating because a lot of the pilgrims were actually connected to the church in some way. They were religious, but only one of them comes out well. Chaucer is actually describing a church in crisis, and they are baddies. Some of you may have done this for O level or A level, or just done it at school as either in history or English, in your English or history lessons. There's a monk and a friar and a prioress and a pardoner and a summoner and a poor priest. And the only one that comes out of it well is the poor priest. The others, we would say today, it's a bit, that Chaucer was writing in a satirical way. He was poking, well, not poking fun at them, he was finding fault with them. Now, how could he get away with that? At a time of great piety, where people have stepped out of line and criticised the church, who could be accused of heresy, and the punishment for heresy, as you know, could be death. How come this man, this eminent writer, thought it was all right to mock the church or people who the clergy or people connected to the church, just as people today mock politicians and get away with it because we are a free society, we've got free speech rights in this country, and so you know how many TV programs have we got, and how many comedians have we got in comedians who laugh and laugh at and mock politicians, don't get arrested. If you did that in Russia, obviously you would get arrested because you've got free speech. So this is fascinating that we'd actually got free speech in this country all those hundreds of years ago, and it was all right to mock the church. Well, not the church itself, but members of the church, people who represented the church. And that says a great deal about how the Black Death had changed people's opinions and attitudes. Because he certainly said horrible things about the monk, he said even more horrible things about the friar. The prioress, he gently mocks. She is a role model, obviously. She's a prioress. She's the second, she's like the deputy headmistress of a school. The abbess would be the boss. The prioress is sort of second in command, or maybe she is the lead. She is the most important person at a priory, which is not quite as important as an abbey or a nunnery. One step down, but a figure of importance, an authority figure. She's mocked because she is worldly. She's vain. She cares about her appearance, which she shouldn't be. She's a nun. She should not be thinking about her appearance. She's wearing jewelry. She shouldn't be wearing jewelry. And she speaks French with a specially posh French accent, which Chaucer mocks. Again, she is vain. She's doing this for attention. She's got this very special way of speaking to show that she's educated. She's showing off. Well, she shouldn't be. She's a nun. She should be humble and modest. And she's not. Now, he's not horrible about her, but he is savage about the pardoner and the summoner. The pardoner is showing people false relics. He's a con man. He's an absolute rogue. How is Chaucer allowed to do this? Criticizing somebody viciously. So that is interesting, that somebody can mock and satirize people who represent the church. And so this cynicism had grown because some people said, well, maybe God sent this as a punishment, but supposing God just didn't know how to stop it. There was a feeling that religion wasn't the answer to everything. There was a feeling that the people were sort of following religion, but in a rather superstitious way. But underneath, they were having doubts. They were having doubts. So the religious consequences are really quite profound. And some people have said eventually they led to the Reformation, the people questioning the teaching of the church in all sorts of ways. And certainly a feeling, the other thing that happened was that because the clergy hadn't been trained properly, they'd done this sort of crash course and just learned the litanies off by heart. They weren't very happy about teaching, about doing a sermon where they were instructing their flock, because they probably weren't too sure themselves about the theories of the religious theories of the atonement, for example. And often they couldn't read or write themselves. There was it was kind of pushed up a bit, but some of them were illiterate. So to compensate for this, they told stories about the saints. And over time, or the best example is the little gold book of St. George, our patron saint. And the little book of St. George had got larger. It had sort of grown. So it wasn't a little book anymore. It was quite getting larger all the time. We don't know very much about St. George, really, at all. Lots of research being done to try and find out more, and very little is known about it. Somebody said one paragraph, really, known, absolutely no solid facts about our patron saint, St. George. However, the little book of St. George concentrated, well, all sorts of stories about him slaying a dragon, which is obviously mythical, but was told as truth. And lots of other stories about St. George, but the main ones were how he was arrested as a Christian and put to death as a martyr. And the stories about how he was put to death became more and more elaborate and more horrible, because that filled the time in nicely. That sort of took the time that a sermon should have taken, where people were instructed in the faith. And also these stories about how St. George was, they're trying to put him to death and failing, were much more exciting for the congregation than listening to doctrine. So it's very tempting to keep adding stories, and it wasn't done. It wasn't done in an attempt to deceive anybody. It was to try and help. It was try to enhance their faith. It wasn't done in an awful cynical way, but it was very tempting to sort of embroider the story and just make it more dramatic. So it ended up with all these attempts to kill the saint, to kill George. I can't remember the order, but one of the ones was they tried to strangle him, and that didn't work. Then they tried to drown him, and the water dried up. They threw him into water, and the water just dried up magically, or by miracle. Then they used a device. They tried to saw him in half, and the device broke. And then they tried to kill him with a sword, and the sword, I mean, a lot of stories were like this. The sword went all floppy and jelly-like and wouldn't stab him. And then they tried to hang him, and the rope broke. And then they tried to drown him again, and the same thing happened. The water dried up. On and on it went. And each time, well, not each time, but over time, these stories grew and grew. They tried to squash him to death. That was a way of killing. That was a way of dealing with heretics. They tried to squash him with stones. Put stones on, and then you put a big board on the stones and press. It was called pressing, and it was a way of killing people. That didn't work either because the stones just turned jelly-like again. They just melted away, or it just didn't work. Nothing worked. They tried chopping his head off, and again, the sword didn't work. And our ancestors would have been sitting there absolutely enthralled by these stories. They were just wonderful to listen to, bearing in mind that they could neither read nor write, and so they couldn't check on any of these facts. They just sat there entranced. And then finally, I think a sword did work, or there was a sort of guillotine thing, and that kept breaking down. They kept trying to sort of chop his head off using a kind of guillotine thing with a blade, and that the blade was never sharp enough, or the blade fell off. And that was an example of, some people called it the corruption of the faith. Well, it isn't corruption, because it wasn't meant to deceive anybody. It was to enhance their faith and their love and their trust in this particular saint. It wasn't done maliciously, and it certainly wasn't done for money. It wasn't a scam of any kind, but it happened all over Europe, and particularly with our St. George, because he was our patron saint. This book just got bigger and bigger. The little book of St. John sort of grew. And that was something our ancestors were very familiar with the stories of saints and martyrs, and these stories being embroidered and enhanced, because the priest was basically ignorant. It was a sort of rush job to get priests in position, and they really hadn't got the proper sort of training. And that became an issue later in terms of the Reformation. So the Black Death had profound effects. And the other thing that we need to remember is that it didn't go away. Like most pandemics, there were breaks in the infection where it appeared to have gone, and everybody breathed a sigh of relief. But what we probably don't understand is that it kept coming back, particularly in hot summers. It went on and was just known as the plague, right through until 1665, where it affected, luckily, London particularly, Eyam in Derbyshire. It didn't spread throughout the whole country at that point, but throughout Tudor times, sort of 200 years after the plague first arrived, it caused devastation, and things had to be postponed. For example, James I, his coronation had to be postponed because plague was rife in London. King Henry VIII moved around the country far more than he would perhaps have chosen to do because of plague. He was terrified of plague. For a big, strong, tough man that presented himself as very macho, Henry VIII had a weakness, and that was he was terrified of plague. So he used to send people out, courtiers out, to investigate an area that he was thinking of going, where he was going hunting, and probably coming back to base at night, but maybe stay overnight wherever he'd been hunting. He sent people out to check carefully what's the situation. And if they came back and said there's been a case of plague, right, we reschedule. We're not going into Hertfordshire, we're going to go to Kent. Go and check out Kent, make sure there's no plague there. They came back and said plague, right, we're not going hunting at all, and stay where we are. The whole court had to be reassured because of the king's fear that there was no plague in the area and hadn't been for several weeks before. He was very, very nervous. He thought that's how he was going to die, and that it was a very unkingly, unmacho way to die. So, he wouldn't have mind dying in battle or dying as a result of jousting, which he was very fond of. One of his main hobbies was jousting. That would have been a manly way to die, but dying in agony, lying in bed, no. didn't want that. It continued to be a problem. And theatres were closed. The Globe Theatre in London was closed. That's how we know how prevalent the plague was, because the records have survived. How often the theatre, particularly the Globe and the theatres in London, had to be closed because of plague. It was an issue. And nobody, of course, nobody knew what caused it. We know that it was a combination of rats, black rats, and fleas. Not the rats we've got today. They are not plague carriers. A lot of people are still terrified of rats. We've got brown rats now. They're the good guys. There's the black rats that are the baddies, and they're extinct. Certainly in this country, we don't have black rats anymore at all. So when people people see a rat and immediately think Black Death, bubonic plague, help. Not the case at all. So we might not write rats, but they're certainly not plague carriers. So we had ancestors who survived, or we wouldn't be here. But it's interesting to speculate on how they were affected by the Black Death. And I think we all ought to be feeling very grateful that although COVID was dreadful, it wasn't as dreadful as the Black Death, which killed half the population of Europe. So on that merry thought, I'll say goodbye to everybody. And I think we all ought to be grateful we live now where there are remedies and injections, and we can, we have a National Health Service, and, you know, we're not having to struggle on our ancestors had, just completely bewildered by it. And,
Whether they
and so,
die doing. My two doctor kids.
Oh, really?
No.
Oh, right, yeah.
Thank you.
thank you.
Bad. Had to do, you know.
Yeah.
Well.
Thank you, Judith. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Judy.
Thank you very much, Judy.